This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through all the business news stories you need to know about from Africa and beyond. But let's start with a quick run through the market, specifically MTN. It's listed both at the JSE and at the same time the Nigerian outlet is also listed in Nigeria too, and the shares have behaved in a very divergent manner today. So for instance, MTN shares at the JSE down about 1.33%, but in Nigeria they rose by the maximum possible amount. They're heading in completely different directions, which then leads us to ask, how exactly are investors in Nigeria and South Africa pricing risk on both sides of the continent? We'll explore that live from Lagos in just a moment. Here's what's coming up tonight. As talks to resolve a Nile Dam dispute resume, the Ethiopian PM calls on South Africa to intervene. A delegation from China heads to Washington to sign the first phase of a trade deal with the United States. And we'll explore the story of innovators in South Africa who are turning plastic bottles into building material. Well, that's and more in the pipeline for you tonight. But let's start with arguably one of the big stories on the continent at the moment. The water and energy ministers of Egypt, Ethiopia and Sudan are expected to meet yet again today in Washington, this time to report on their progress. This comes in the wake of a request from Egypt and Ethiopia to delay filling the dam's reservoir entirely, a request that was denied by Addis Ababa. The Ethiopian Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed Ali has also asked South Africa to intervene in this dispute in the Horn of Africa. Just last week, talks among Ethiopia, Egypt and Sudan failed to reach a consensus on key technical issues of dispute. That includes the rate at which the $4.6 billion Ethiopian Renaissance Dam should be filled up. That dam is about 70% complete at the moment.
Ethiopia always believes in win-win approach with Egypt and the Sudan, and we're following the same track. And the current request for President Ramaphosa, as he is a good friend for both Ethiopia and Egypt, also as incoming AU chair, he can make a discussion between both parties so as to solve the issue peacefully, because peace is a foundation for everything here in Africa.
The Nile River is important to both countries, and there must be a way in which their interests can be addressed, and there must be a way in which a solution can be found. As for ourselves, we are willing to play a role in facilitating whatever agreement that can be crafted, and we will remain supportive to finding peaceful solutions between countries on our continent.
Now, you are going to be hearing a lot about this story in the course of the week, so let's bring in our correspondents who are covering it from Egypt and Ethiopia. Yasser Hakim joins us live from Cairo. Colette Njohi is live in Addis Ababa tonight. Let's get into the details on this, starting with you, Yasser. Talks resume today in Washington, D.C., but going into this, is there anything that Egypt has changed or is willing to compromise on?
Not that we know of. Egypt has made it clear that it has given all it can in the negotiations to try to show the goodwill, and accepting the GERD or the Renaissance Dam in itself is seen as a compromise by Egypt, as it could be harmful to the downstream country. So accepting it is in itself a point that Egypt feels shows the goodwill and intention to find a solution to the whole issue. And at the same time, Egypt has given its own ideas throughout the years of negotiations between both sides, and has shown its points concerning how the Renaissance Dam should be filled in a way that would be beneficial for Egypt and without harming the development projects of Ethiopia. and that Egypt only needs guarantees, written and clear guarantees, whether during the filling of the dam or during the operations of the dam, that it will not affect Egypt's annual share of water, which is the main source of water for Egypt from the Nile River. The main source of drinking water comes from the Nile River, so
Right.
Egypt wants to guarantee that it will not be affected during the operations of the dam.
Coletta, what about the Ethiopian side? What are we hearing from Addis Ababa? Is there anything that the country is willing to compromise on?
Basing on the reports or on the proclamations, if I would call that, from the Minister of Water, from the last talks that we had here last week, Ethiopia is kind of bent on the fact that Egypt is changing positions at the last minute when it knows they're going into a discussion that would easily invoke mediation. So Ethiopia is going in hoping that Egypt will reduce its conditions, because now Egypt says they want between 12 to 21 years of filling the dam reservoirs, and Ethiopia says at least between 4 and 7 years. So Ethiopia is going in hoping that it is Egypt that will compromise probably and reduce the number of years that it's demanding. And it's also hoping that the talks will not go into mediation, because we know Ethiopia from the onset since 2011 when it started building the dam, it said that this is a matter of national pride. It is a matter of economic issue for itself and also in terms of export and its economic development. And it's going in the talks in Washington hoping that Egypt will be the one that will come down and understand that Ethiopia still stands and insists that it will honor the agreement that it has made with Egypt, that it will not spoil anything for Egypt in terms of operation of the dam.
Right, so Yasser, let's come back to that, because Egypt disputed quite vehemently that timeline that we keep hearing about from Ethiopia's water minister, 12 to 21 years. Let's try and clear this up. What proposal was put on the table in talks last week?
All right, after the talks last week ended, Egypt's foreign ministry issued a statement saying that all that was said from the Ethiopian side concerning the 12 to 21 years has been distorted information and misleading, and that Egypt has not, and it made it clear, has not talked about any numbers in the 12 and 21 years at all. The ministry reiterated Egypt's stance that from 2 years ago, Egypt has said that it is its years, or its proposal is around 6 to 7 years, and that last week it stood by this, and Egypt's proposal remains 6 to 7 years and not 12 to 21 years as stated by the Ethiopian side. So Egypt refuted this statement and said that it goes into the talks remaining with 6 to 7 years, and that Egypt's proposal is linked to the two very important issues, the drought and also when there is a flooding, how the dam will be filled during the years of drought or years of flooding, in a way that it will not harm Egypt's share and will not also harm Ethiopia. And according to the calculations, the conclusion is around 6 to 7 years. So there's no change there. There's no compromise there. Egypt remains with this and stands by this. And if this is what Ethiopia says, 12 to 21 years is too much, Egypt says we want 6 to 7 years, what we want before, and if Ethiopia agrees to that and would guarantee that, then I think there will be no problems.
Right, we'll get back to the drought question in just a moment. Coletta, I know this is going to be a sensitive question and a sensitive matter because it's essentially giving up some level of sovereignty. But would Ethiopia be open to having a multilateral third party, or say a combination of the World Bank, representatives from Ethiopia, Sudan and Egypt, because they're all essentially along the Blue Nile? Would it be open to having them managing that dam filling schedule?
Well, if we base on what Ethiopia has said since it started constructing in 2011, it has looked at the Grand Renaissance Dam as a dam of the people of Ethiopia. And we saw Ethiopia looking for money from within the citizens, people giving in as little as 10 birr and all that to be part of this. So it has been built around the national pride, something that should be for the Ethiopians, by the Ethiopians. So it would be interesting to see if Ethiopia would accept a third party to be part of the operation of the dam. And if the mediation, if the talks in Washington don't go through and they are forced to invoke a mediation, then it will be interesting to know what are the details of the mediation. But it will be really hard for Ethiopia to accept a multi or a third party operator of the dam. We know there have been talks, maybe the World Bank, the US, the Egypt itself wanted to be part of the operation, but Ethiopia said no from the onset. So depending on what comes out in Washington, then it will also depend, and it will also decide what Ethiopia will push for in terms of the mediation details.
Right, Yasser, let's take the contrarian view here. If there's no deal by the 15th of January, what will Egypt do next?
All right. First, to make things clear, the use of force is out of question. And this, the Egyptian president said it a few times. Just to put this out of the way, it's not thinkable use of force against any country in this regard, especially countries that are from the continent and neighbors. So the other options we have now, if things don't go as planned, is to move to the legal side, probably go to the UN, to arbitration, international law, to see what are the rights of a country like Egypt and Sudan, downstream countries in the case of water issues and water rights, and try to dispute this in the international community and international law, and try to come out with some kind of a binding agreement or a binding law that would force Ethiopia to guarantee for Egypt that the operations and the filling of the dam would not harm Egypt's share of water from the Nile. So I guess this will be the next step, some mediation, strong and quick mediation from other countries, not mediation that would prolong the process further until the dam is built and is fact on the ground that Egypt would not be able to change the way it is operated. So Egypt will have to move quickly in this regard through diplomatic means and international law to try to get its rights on concerning the water share of the River Nile.
Indeed, of course, and the dam is about 70% complete at the moment. One last question for you, Coletta. So drought mitigation is a huge concern for Egypt, other than, of course, water access. What's the agreement between the two countries at the moment, or what are the parameters of the discussion around how to define a drought and how reservoir filling and dam operation should happen if there is a drought?
Well, based on the round technical talks that happened here in Addis Ababa last week, the Minister of Water said that they had at least a clear outline with Egypt and a clear understanding that the two countries would work together to ensure that they monitor the water levels so that Ethiopia does not use a lot of water, if I would use that in a simple term, Ethiopia does not use a lot of water when it's a bit pressing in terms of drought and all these. And also they said that they would monitor the water, the three of them, because they are part of this, this project affects Sudan, Egypt and that. So they're talking about having a committee that will monitor the water together. Now, how that will be done, the details are yet to be put out, because this will only determine, because this also bases the argument of Egypt that Ethiopia might propel its own economic regards or its own economic plans up here and affect them even during drought times. So it is a matter that will still be streamlined according to the talks that they're having in Washington and moving forward, because they need details and assurances that each will stand by what they've said.
Indeed, a very touchy topic. Coletta Njohi there live in Addis Ababa, and of course Yasser Kim joining us from Cairo as well. You can expect to hear a lot more from them in the course of the week. On to West Africa now. Nigerian banks have started implementing a revised guide to bank charges for consumers. Now, the new central bank directive to that effect essentially mandates commercial banks and non-bank financial institutions to cut a broad range of fees, everything from how you manage bank accounts to electronic transfers and even the cost of using ATMs. Take a look.
The revised policy is part of a new guideline released by the Central Bank of Nigeria. It replaces the Guide to Charges by Banks and Other Financial Institutions issued in 2017. While it may be reviewed from time to time, experts believe it would have a positive impact on the well-being of Nigerians and the economy in general.
It will reduce the burden, the financial burden on individuals, because at times, in some banks in Nigeria, when you carry out a transaction once, they still charge you that 65 naira. But with CBN stepping in now and actually threatening the banks that anyone that contravenes this new policy will be sanctioned, I think it is, a fantastic thing for the Nigerian populace and for Nigerians.
Typically, Nigerian banks charge roughly 14 US cents for all interbank transfers via digital channels, regardless of the amount being transferred. Also, ATM users will only be allowed to make 3 withdrawals from banks other than their parent bank in a month, after which they will be charged roughly 18 US cents. There are also monthly fees for ATM maintenance and SMS alerts. But the new CBN directive changes all this, while resonating with millions of Nigerians who are often discouraged from embracing digital channels.
It's a good development because the bank charges are really a lot. Now, you want to transfer something, they charge you. You want to use the POS, they charge you. You want to use the ATM, they charge you. They charge you for your SMS that you should get, your email notifications, everything. They charge you for literally everything.
As per the new CBN directive, account holders will only pay about 10 naira for electronic transfers below 5,000 naira and 25 naira for transfers between 5,000 to 50,000 naira. Additionally, only electronic transfers above 50,000 naira will attract a 50 naira charge. Card maintenance fee, on the other hand, has been reviewed to 50 naira every 3 months from the initial monthly period. To enforce the directive, the Central Bank of Nigeria states that any financial institution that breaches any of the provisions will face a penalty of about $5,500 US for every violation. Beryl Oro, CGTN.
All right, then, a quick run through some company headlines. $30 billion, you're going to hear that in this story and the next. The state-owned oil company, Saudi Aramco, says it's exercised its green shoe option to sell an extra 450 million shares. That essentially raises the size of its IPO to $29.4 billion, or if you're not counting 30 billion. Aramco initially raised about $25.6 billion. That in itself was a record level in its December IPO by selling 3 billion shares at about 32 Saudi riyals each, but it had indicated it could sell additional shares through over-allotment. Elsewhere, Africa's richest man, Aliko Dangote, says he believes that in the next 2 years, his group of companies will start generating annual turnover of $30 billion. Dangote's ambitious projection is based on the fact that the Dangote Refinery Limited, that so far has cost him about $12 billion to build, will soon become operational. Once that happens, the Lagos-based refinery should become among the largest in the world, processing some 650,000 barrels of crude every day. In South Africa, Eskom's former chair, Jabu Mabuza, resigned on Friday after apologizing for failing to put a decisive end to power cuts in South Africa, especially over Christmas and the New Year holidays. The state-owned utility implemented some pretty severe nationwide cuts in several bursts last year and again sporadically this week. The power cuts dented economic output last year and they sapped investor confidence in efforts to turn around Africa's most industrialized economy. And finally, South Africa's Massmart Holdings could cut up to 1,440 jobs under a plan to close up to 34 stores. Massmart is majority owned by the American retail giant Walmart. It sunk to its first half trading loss in 2 decades last August as low growth, high unemployment and the rising cost of living hurt South African spending power. The retailer is consulting with unions and other stakeholders on how this closure can occur. That's a run through your company headlines. 20 minutes into the hour, you're watching Global Business Africa. Here's what's coming up next. Nigeria's dropped a $2 billion tax claim against MTN, but this isn't the end of the story. And Egypt plans to switch from food subsidies to cash payments for the poor. All that and more is coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business, only on CGTN.
every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sutra. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how all stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business. Africa is the nexus of enterprise, and Global Business will tell you why it matters.
From the mega investment projects to multi-billion-dollar mergers and acquisitions.
Africa today collects, just in terms of revenues from taxes alone, $545 billion a year. If you take 10% of that and you devote it to the energy sector, problem solved.
All this on Global Business, weekdays at this time on CGTN.
Welcome back. Nigeria's head of state, Muhammadu Buhari, has signed the finance bill into law. Now, it's specifically designed to support its implementation and investments by the private sector. It should also support small enterprises in line with the ease of doing business reforms. Now, the tax reforms aim to provide incentives for infrastructure and capital markets investments. It also aims to boost government revenues by amending some tax laws and making them more responsive to the needs of businesses in Nigeria. Now, the acts that have been changed include the Companies Income Tax Act, the Value Added Tax Act, Custom and Excise Tariff Act, among others. Now, MTN Nigeria shares, as we mentioned at the start of the hour, were up by 10%. That's the maximum allowed daily limit on Monday, the highest in 2 weeks, in fact. This comes after the country's Attorney General withdrew a $2 billion tax claim against a South African telecommunications firm. Now, the case was being very closely observed by critics who said it damaged Nigeria's appeal to foreign investors. MTN said the government had decided to drop the case and instead it's referring it to tax and customs authorities. All right, then, this has been one long and drawn-out battle, so let's see what the next chapter is going to be looking like. Deji Banbos joins me now live from Lagos with more information on this. So, Deji, what exactly were the AG's reasons for dropping this claim in the first place?
Thank you very much, Ramah. The Office of the Attorney General did not give any reason now for dropping the case, neither did MTN. I think what has happened in this case is that common sense has actually prevailed. I mean, this was always going to be a very difficult case for the Office of the Attorney General. It would appear MTN had a very solid case. I mean, its argument was solid, so to speak. I've actually spoken to some very senior lawyers here, and that's what, of course, they told me before now, that MTN had a very solid case. So I think in the end, the Office of the Attorney General basically used common sense and decided to just let this go. And besides, at some point, there would have been some intervention now from higher up, probably from the presidency, just to ensure that this does not go too forward, because already people were complaining that the case itself was not good for investment in this country. So I think that is exactly why the Office of the Attorney General has decided to drop the case, even though it's not come out to give any reason for doing so.
Indeed, but this isn't 100% over here, because the claim, as we understand it, has been referred now to the tax and customs authorities to resolve what the AG's office described as contentious issues. But what exactly are they talking about there?
Well, I think it's still the same issue, because you just have to go back to the very inception of this case. Basically, what happened, the Office of the Attorney General asked MTN back in 2018 to conduct a self-assessment over its tax liabilities. Now, something MTN refused to do, insisting that the Office of the Attorney General didn't have the powers to do that it was the responsibility of the Federal Inland Revenue Service and, of course, the Nigerian Customs Service. And basically, that argument of MTN is what the Office of the Attorney General has decided to follow, because what the Attorney General has done is basically to refer the case now to the Federal Inland Revenue Service, and of course the Customs Service. So what both bodies will now do is sit down and look and see if MTN at all was involved in any infraction, and then going forward, it will now decide what MTN would have to pay. But look, Ramah, I think this might just be the end of the case. I think it probably would have been some kind of face saving for the government to refer this, for the Office of the Attorney General now, to refer this to the Federal Inland Revenue Service and the Customs Service, because all the while, when the case was in court, the FIRS and the Customs Service did not offer any opinion at all. They did not come out to make any claim against MTN, did not come out to say MTN defaulted in its tax commitment. So basically, this might just be some kind of face-saving measure for the government. But we just have to wait and see what comes out of it. Do not also forget that when MTN actually it was actually MTN that took the government now to court, and MTN actually claimed damages to the tune of $8.3 million. Now MTN now says it is going to withdraw its case, and so good for everyone. I don't think anything is going to come out of this. There's a possibility that some kind of reconciliation has been done behind closed doors, and you know, just a face-saving measure, if you like.
Right. So, but is there any acknowledgement from authorities in Nigeria? Because looking at the way this MTN saga has played out, especially from 2018, there was that $8 billion repatriation demand from the Central Bank of Nigeria, settled for $53 million. Then there's this incident now where the Attorney General came up and said, I want $2 billion in taxes. And now he's essentially referred the case to a third party, and it might actually die there. Isn't there an acknowledgement that this essentially paints Nigeria as a place that's hostile to foreign capital, that a place that's difficult to do business in?
The government will never admit that publicly. People have said so. You know, business experts and investors have actually said so. But all this while the case was in court, you know, the government never for once came out to admit publicly that its action now was not investor friendly. And I don't expect the government to do that. But there's a possibility that the government actually saw along that line, you know, and that's the reason why it's decided to take this action. But to come out publicly to admit that, I do not expect to see that happen. But everybody would tell you that the action was basically not investor friendly, especially for a country that is seeking, especially foreign investment now. And so you don't want to continue to push on with this case, and investors will sit somewhere and they begin to look at the case and then just think, well, look, is this environment actually friendly for investment? Would my investment be protected? Is there a possibility that the government might just decide to change its law or come up with a different interpretation of its own law now just to affect my business? And so I think when you add all of this together, it's not difficult to see why the government has decided to toe this line, even though it has not admitted publicly that its action in the first place was not investor friendly.
Indeed. Let's see how this plays out when it gets to the Federal Inland Revenue Service. Teji Badmus there live in Lagos. Now, let's move on to Egypt. The government over there is studying ways of replacing the subsidy system it has at the moment with cash payments to the poor instead of delivering actual goods. Here's CGTN's Yasser Hakim explaining how it would work.
Egypt's food subsidy system is based on ration cards for the low-income earners. It includes about 20 food items for each family. Over half the population benefits from the food rations. However, the subsidy system has faced a lot of complications.
The challenge for the citizen is the need to wait for hours in queues for their rations. They're forced to take the products on the ration cards regardless of the quantity and the quality available. For the government, the main challenge lies in the outlets taking the subsidized products and selling them at market price, making unlawful profits, which is a form of corruption.
That's why the government has been studying providing cash payments rather than food subsidies.
The advantage of cash payment is that the citizen takes the money and they buy their needs without restriction. He's not forced to take what is on the ration card that he might not need. For the government, it will save billions spent on the subsidy system itself. The gathering and distribution of the subsidized goods is a costly procedure. Secondly, it will shut the door of corruption because everyone will take the allotted amount of cash. no illegal dealings with products and goods, and a simpler system will be established.
Egyptians had mixed reactions to the idea.
Cash payments are better because this allows us to buy the goods we need, not what's available on the ration cards.
The ration cards are better because if you cash the money, you will buy the products from the market at higher prices, so the cash will not cover much goods.
And the idea itself is still to be discussed by Parliament. It's still in the early stage of studies, so no details have been released yet. However, experts believe that if approved, it will take a few years for the government to adopt the new cash payment system for subsidies. Yas Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Now then, one other story you're keeping a very close eye on at the moment. A Chinese delegation is in Washington, D.C. to sign the first phase of a trade deal in the Sino-US trade war. Now, it consists essentially of tariff cuts to some extent that will in turn boost Chinese purchases of US energy and manufactured goods. It's also expected to address some disputes over intellectual property. Now, once this deal is signed, the US President Donald Trump will travel to Beijing to start talks on Phase 2. Let's get you the latest information on this developing story. CGTN's Jim Spellman joins us now live from Washington, D.C. With the latest. Jim, good to see you. So walk us through what we know about the obligations of both parties in this Phase 1 agreement.
Well, let's begin by setting the stage, Ram. I'm at Dulles Airport outside Washington, D.C. The Air China jet that we believe is holding the Vice Premier and the trade delegation landed just within the last few minutes. We expect them to make their way then to waiting limousines and head into Washington, D.C. On Tuesday, they'll meet with business leaders. On Wednesday, a big signing that will be carried live at the White House. What is in this deal? Here's what we know at this point. We know that this 86-page text, it has not been released yet, but we know the U.S. held off on adding new tariffs back in December. They also cut the tariff rate in half on another $120 billion that had gone into effect in September. From the U.S., the good news in this deal is there are alleged, apparently, according to the White House, commitments to buy more U.S. products, including a significant amount of agriculture. Soybean farmers here in the U.S. particularly have been hit very hard. And as you mentioned, there are expected to be, to some degree, guarantees in this about technology transfers and intellectual property. We also understand from the U.S. side that there is a robust enforcement mechanism that will see offices set up in Washington and in Beijing where both sides can address any concerns they may have. We all are looking forward to learning more when the text of this agreement is released. We expect that to happen Wednesday as the deal is signed. Ramah?
Indeed. So the deal, though, still leaves roughly $370 billion of imports from China still essentially hit with tariffs. So in that sense, I mean, it doesn't really change much, does it?
I think it changes a couple of things. First off, it stops anything from getting worse. And while that may not seem like progress, I think to a lot of farmers here in the United States and manufacturers, it is something. It allows them to have a much more predictable year ahead of them. And for the politically important agriculture sector here, it gives President Trump something he can brag about to them heading into the election. I think also it sets a different mood for these Phase 2 talks. It changes the whole tone around this from one of tit-for-tat retaliations, tariffs, counter tariffs, et cetera. And I think that finally what it really does is it sends a message to the larger business community, the global business community, that there is a new kind of progress being made and that perhaps that companies can start to plan differently and to start to reach out again in some of these sectors where people have been hesitant to act because of all the uncertainty around the trade war. Ramah?
Indeed. So one last question for you. Farmers, you mentioned that a little earlier in our conversation. They were targeted really, really hard by retaliatory tariffs. In October, the data from the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, pointed out that farm debt is at record highs, $416 billion, and bankruptcies up 24% year on year as of October. Given what we've seen now, should we expect those two trends to keep rising?
There's a lot to take apart when you talk about the agriculture sector. Here in the United States, in the Midwest, there was terrible rains all year, and it was a very difficult year for farmers. Some are still harvesting crops that should have been harvested months ago because they had to plant them so much later. So things like that will always exist in the agriculture sector. and those are not going away. High prices for some of these commodities were 5 or 6 years ago, so it's a struggling thing. But I think this will be a lot different. Farmers that have been going deeper into debt because of this uncertainty, trying to weather what's going on, will now have a much different scenario ahead of them as they begin making decisions now for what they'll plant in a couple of months. It could actually be a boom year for farmers. Many of them will look to get back on solid ground. And that, again, I cannot repeat this enough, is a huge political victory for President Trump, who will count on farmers in those valuable swing states to help him in the election later in the year. Ramah?
Indeed, we have to keep an eye on the November elections, don't we? Jim Spellman there live in Washington, D.C. Thank you very much. You can, of course, expect to hear a lot more about the Phase 1 trade deal right here in the next 72 hours or so. Time for a short break on the program. We're back in 2 minutes.
Again, began holding guns. Machine guns from police forces toward the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
Business in Africa is at a crossroads. We celebrate those who are adopting and thriving despite the challenges, from grassroots to big businesses. Global Business takes you along for the ride as we track the making of a giant.
Only on CGTN.
Economic data out of the country. The country's foreign currency reserves.
With a dedicated and diverse team of anchors, CGTN now brings Africa to the palm of your hand.
I'm Perina Karibe in the heart of Nairobi, which is bustling.
From everyday heroes to the continent's most powerful figures, we bring their voices to you.
We haven't changed. And this is something most of us are very excited about.
We bring you news that's changing perspectives.
From Nairobi City Center.
News that brings Africa to the world. CGTN. See the difference. How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are the stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back. Let's recap the stories making your headlines at this hour. Villagers in Nigeria have been hit by a wave of violent attacks carried out by nomadic herdsmen. Now, according to the Global Terror Index, the attacks are believed to have been carried out by Fulani herders. The nomads are said to have killed more Nigerians in 2018 than the Islamist group Boko Haram. Elsewhere, leaders of the Sahel G5 countries are set to meet with President Emmanuel Macron in France, or rather they have met already. The meeting is expected to address the presence of French troops in the region, as well as the fight against jihadists operating there. The United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres and other top diplomats from the EU and the African Union are also attending that particular meeting. And Russia is hosting major players in the Libyan conflict. The Khalifa Haftar-led LNA, the Libyan National Army, and the United Nations-recognized Government of National Accord are expected to sign a ceasefire agreement. On Sunday, both sides agreed to a conditional truce. It started at midnight. The warring factions have already accused each other of breaking that truce. That's the run through your headlines. Now, catfish is an important product in China's trade with the United States, so much so, in fact, that the fish is actually singled out in the trade talks. China is among the few countries that's allowed to export that particular fish species to America. CGTN's Lucy Rui has more from Anhui Province.
The United States is a big consumer of catfish, but its supply is highly dependent on imports. China has been one of its major suppliers. More than 90% of China's catfish products were exported to the U.S. When exports peaked in 2006, 600,000 tons shipped to America. Anhui-based Fuhuang Shenzhen is one of the major companies in China's catfish trade.
American consumers like catfish a lot. Our products are very popular over there because they are cheap and of high quality.
But the honeymoon didn't last long. A farm bill adopted in 2008 resulted in a sharp decline of imports from China due to higher standards in antibiotics and fish products. But Zhang believes the American policy change was more of a protectionist move. Still, in 2015, the U.S. government decided that countries must implement inspection programs equivalent to that in the U.S. Otherwise, their exports would not be allowed to its market. As a result, the number of the Chinese companies in the business shrank from more than 100 to 5.
Last May, Washington slapped a 25% tariff on Chinese imports as part of the trade war. China's aquatic exports become one of the hard-hit business as a result. After rounds of negotiations, last November, China was finally confirmed as one of the countries eligible to export catfish to the U.S. So will this bring some relief to China's aquatic exports to the U.S.?
I think in the coming years, catfish exports to U.S. would increase a bit, but not much. Now exports to the U.S. account for just 5% of China's total catfish products. Even if it increases, it's not likely to exceed 10%.
But the catfish industry in China is by no means doomed. Markets are emerging elsewhere, including within China. In 2019, more than 100,000 tons of catfish products from Zhang's company alone were consumed in the domestic market. Meanwhile, the international market is also growing. That made Zhang feel confident about his company, as well as the catfish industry of the country will still thrive despite the trade war with the U.S.
China's Belt and Road Initiative is increasing our business opportunities with Singapore, for instance, and all other Southeast Asian countries. There used to be very little demand from these countries, but now orders are increasing significantly.
Zhang said that even with the current tariff remains in place, American consumers still tend to prefer Chinese goods because of the obvious cheaper price and high-quality advantages. Lucy Rui, Chaohu, Anhui Province.
This next story will provide some ammunition to Luddites. The traditional hiring process is slowly fading away in South Korea as employers look to algorithms to help them find the best possible workers for their companies. Now, that may be good business for enterprises, but these algorithms are causing a lot of frustration among job seekers. Here's why.
안녕하세요. 만나서 반갑습니다.
Kim Sung-woo is a 22-year-old student from one of South Korea's top universities. He's practicing an interview for a job, but it's not a person he's speaking to, it's an AI computer algorithm. Kim failed a previous AI interview for a retail job and he's now at technology firm Midas IT to learn more about how machine-based interviews work. Kim is visibly nervous and fidgeting as his verbal and facial expressions are deconstructed and analyzed by a lifeless machine.
When you prepare for job interviews or exams, people know how to get a high score or make themselves seem positive and friendly. You can't really do that for AI interviews, so all the preparation for it feels meaningless.
More companies are now applying AI to the hiring process. Data from the Korean Economic Research Institute shows that nearly a quarter of the top 131 corporations currently use or plan to use AI in hiring. South Koreans are trying to beat the machine as AI grows in popularity for the hiring process. Large cram schools are doing booming business, teaching job applicants to maintain composure and positive facial expression to score points. Some job seekers are worried about the additional expense and workload to prepare for AI interviews.
I'll need to sign up for cram schools for the AI interview, so I feel like the conventional interviews with people are better.
Meanwhile, for the earnest Kim Sun-woo, he had decided that the AI interview is too much of a stumbling block for now, and he's better off pursuing graduate school before rethinking about beating the machines. Zheng Junfeng, CGTN.
Germans may soon have to pay a deposit when they buy new electronic devices, particularly smartphones and tablets. The Green Party's proposal aims to boost the recycling of used devices. Here's CGTN's Rebecca Bunden reporting from Frankfurt.
Smartphones in Germany could become more expensive. The Green Party is proposing a new law forcing consumers to pay a €25 deposit on mobiles and tablets, which they'll only get back when they return a device for recycling.
We're looking at a general problem in Germany, but also across Europe, that we have too little recycling and too much waste, all in the e-sector, but also in other sectors. In the e-sector, the e-waste is a specific problem. We have a lot of resources which go into smartphones and other electronic goods, and they could be recycled.
It's estimated that German citizens produce an average of 20 kilos of electronic waste a year, and less than half of that gets recycled.
Many smartphones and tablets end up in landfills, or they're sent on to developing countries where labourers sometimes use dangerous chemicals to extract the different elements. But often discarded phones simply end up sitting in people's drawers as consumers try to keep up with the latest technology.
Some 24 million new smartphones are sold in Germany every year. There are small quantities of precious metals in each phone. Collectively, this amounts to 720 kilos of gold and 7.3 tons of silver, as well as hundreds of tons of aluminium and copper. Environmentalists say such materials can pollute groundwater and a lot can be reused. But not everyone's happy to fork out a deposit on a phone.
I don't think that everyone is able to pay these €25. It sounds like not much, but I feel like not everyone can afford a phone.
I'm personally for it. In any case, I'm not against it. Paying €25 wouldn't be a problem for me.
So considering the environment and the things that are happening, so I would not mind paying the deposit.
EU regulations have set an electronics recycling target of 65%. The German Green Party says strict measures are needed if that target is to be met. Rebecca Bunden, CGTN, Frankfurt.
Quick run through commodity prices for you, focusing on oil at the very start. So Brent is essentially still paring off some of the gains that we saw off the back of tensions between the United States and Iran. 64.44 at 17.55 GMT. It's essentially still falling at the moment. Gulf tensions easing, but will the US-China trade deal, a bit of rapprochement if you will, add essentially a bit of boost under that price? We'll have to wait and see. Palladium in the meantime is still essentially climbing. We're barely 13 days into the year. It's up by 0.5% today, 9% in total so far in the year. Here's what's coming up next. We'll explore how plastic bottles can be recycled into building materials in South Africa when we come back. I will introduce you to a Nigerian doctor with a soft spot for these reptiles when we return.
Images may appear to be identical, but looks can be deceiving. The difference is not always obvious. It has to be discovered. There are always different sides to a story. We put the focus on the details. To see more, to understand better. CGTN. See the difference.
You don't find the stories of North Africa by sitting on the sidelines. No one else will take you where we can in North Africa. And no one else will show you what it's all about. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back. Plastic bottles in South Africa's Cape Town are getting put to some rather good use. About South Africans are using them as a core material to build structures. They already used their tech to help build an early childhood development centre. Here's CGTN's Asta Tal with that story on Grassroots tonight.
When Matt Baker sits among these bottles, he doesn't see waste. Instead, he sees potential building materials. Waste ED, co-founded by Baker, uses the bottles to make eco-bricks.
So making eco-bricks as a temporary solution is very important to see it as a temporary solution so that we really can focus on the bigger problems, the source problem, not just, the problem that there's waste around us and that it's not very nice to look at, but rather dealing with the root of it, that producing these types of non-recyclables isn't right.
Indeed, the country faces a waste management challenge. Out of the 42 million tons of waste generated in 2017, only 11% was recycled. Waste ED is collaborating with the Natural Building Collective to test their eco-bricks in different climatic conditions.
And we're going to do a couple more freestanding tests in the parking lot, just lighting unplastered eco-brick walls, just to see how they behave. Because eco-bricks have been used in every fashion you can imagine. And what's nice about the testing phase here is that we will be able to provide data to people all over the world.
School children are also taking part in the fun.
It is very colorful, and that the children learn all different kinds of colors of the eco bricks. And we first used to throw it away into buns, but now I can see what you can all out of the eco block, the bottles and all the papers. You can buy all kinds of stuff with it.
Residents of Cape Town can join in Waste ED's efforts by dropping off their bottles in the over 20,000 eco-brick collection points. Asta Tal, CGTN.
And finally, a vet in Nigeria has made it his life's mission to save endangered animals. Dr. Mark Ofwa rehabilitates animals, including reptiles like snakes, before releasing them back into the wild. CGTN's Deji Banwas has more on his story.
He is called the Snake Man of Lagos, and it's because of his closeness and care for the creepy and dreaded reptile. In a society where the first instinct is either to run away or kill the creature on sighting it, Mark Ofwa is trying to show people here that a snake can actually be a friend.
I started a crusade to educate people more about snakes and the need to conserve them, because this fear of snakes has led to us killing them with prejudice. So I go about teaching people respect for snakes, how to cohabit with snake and all that.
He says he developed a special love for snakes from his teenage years after an awkward experience while studying in a garden.
While I was reading, I felt a sensation on my feet and I looked down and there was a cobra. I paused in fear The cobra also must have sensed my movement. It paused in fear, and our eyes were locked for what seemed like eternity. And then after a while, it just faced forward and slithered away. From then, I started asking myself, so snakes are not really the mindless killing machines we think them to be. And then that sparked up an interest, and I've been studying snakes ever since.
Ofwa is today a practicing veterinarian and an animal conservationist specializing in small animal practice. He runs St. Mark's Animal Hospital and Shelter in Lagos. Besides dogs and cats, which are common in his shelter, there are also rare and endangered species as well, like the pangolin. He rescues most of the endangered species that are not dead from local hunters and brings them to his shelter for rehabilitation before releasing them back into the wild.
The point where these animals come from is the hunters. These are the people that go into the bush to get these animals for the bushmeat trade. So yes, I try to create a relationship with them where if there are traps, I try to educate them to stop, but this is their source of livelihood. I tell them that, good, if you get anyone alive, if you get anyone sick or injured, just bring it to me. Babies especially, that they can't eat, obviously, they bring them to me. Now, I do my best not to pay. I try to create a relationship with them where I exchange services for these animals. And it's been working.
Ofwa says he may not be able to save all the animals in need, but for everyone he rehabilitates and releases back into the wild, the effect on the world at large cannot be quantified.
For every animal that I release back to the wild, I can't put in words the feeling. It's almost spiritual. It's ethereal, I can assure you. The fact that you know that if not for you, this particular animal would have been killed and eaten or used for rituals or something, but you have stepped in and you've given this animal another lease on life and then released to the wild where it can go live its life and procreate. You're something like a savior.
There are over 60 animals in his shelter here that he must cater for on a daily basis. It's a lot of hard work, but it's one Ofwa says he's always happy doing.
The major work in conservation of animals can only be done by the government. You understand? They're the ones that can put laws to protect the species. They're the ones that can create parks that would ensure survival of the species and all that. But if we leave the whole work for the government to do, they will be overwhelmed because they have a government to run. So this is my way of contributing my quota to conservation of the species.
Deji Badmos, CGTN, Lagos, Nigeria.
Right then, a quick run through the currencies here for you. Very brief focus on the South African rand. In the year so far, 13 days in, it's about 3% weaker against the American dollar. Start of the year around 14, now essentially 14.45, 14.40 is the number we're looking at. Later on in the week, we're going to have the first rate-setting meeting of the year from the South African Reserve Bank. The general expectation is that they're essentially going to keep rates where they are, 6.5%. But will that actually happen? We'll find out and update you. That's it for tonight's edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen on the program in the last hour or so. There are many ways to get your thoughts back to us. All of them are on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.